Hey everyone, it is Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. So, as you may have noticed, I did manage to score a little keyboard to use today, and I'll be able to, have business more or less as usual here, coming to you from Jupiter, Florida today. So, we're going to be talking about borrowed chords mostly. We'll also be talking about secondary dominants, kind of wrapping up some of that. Secondary dominants are going to be with us for a while. So broader context, yes, we're talking about the material that we're covering in the harmony course right now. So we're going to look at some stuff involving secondary dominants. We're going to look at this transitioning into discussion of borrowed chords. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to make sure that I mention at some point today. And so let me think of one of them right now, and that is the term backdoor dominant. I'm not positive if I've used that term yet. I probably used it in one of the lessons, but whether I've mentioned it in the live streams, but this is going to be a term you're going to hear when I talk about borrowed chords. When I talk about the minor 4 chord, that is what it is. But there's this other chord, the flat 7 chord. So in the key of C, if we have a chord progression, and then we have a minor 4 chord, followed by this flat 7 dominant to 1, this flat 7 to 1 has a name. It's called the backdoor dominant. It's kind of a slang term, but and the idea of this is normally you think about the dominant, meaning scale degree 5. A dominant 7th chord built on scale degree 5 is the front door if you're trying to come home, right? If you're trying to come from 5 to 1, that's the front door. That's the best way I can explain that. And that's the normal way to get to 1. But this other flat 7 to 1 is it's like coming in the back door. It's like a slightly more unusual way to reach 1 that comes from borrowed chords. So that's the thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned. And I don't even remember the other thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned. So if it comes up, it comes up. And if not, I'll mention it some other time. So I'm not going to worry about it. And glad to see where people are coming from. In Jupiter right now in Florida, it's actually on the cool side for Florida. It's like only in the 70s. Yeah, it's in the 70s despite being afternoon. So it started to finally cool off here. It's been, 80s and 90s before. So anyhow, beautiful day here. So what I'm going to do now is flip over to where I have people who have uploaded some things, and we're going to take a look at some of the material that has been uploaded. And I want to show you, if you haven't seen already, if you didn't see my comment, the new bookmark feature. So I didn't implement this. Circle is its own thing. I've done some customizations, but this site is hosted on a platform called Circle, and they just implemented this pretty cool bookmark feature. So these are some scores, some posts from people that I've bookmarked, and we're going to get to a few of these today. And this is how you can bookmark something. If you're looking at a post, you just click that little bookmark icon, and it bookmarks it. Click it again, and it removes it. Click it again, and it adds it back. So it's a really useful feature. If there's things man, I want to come back to this thing. I don't feel like creating a whole browser bookmark that's really hard to delete later or hard to find later. This is really easy to create and delete them, and really easy to access them from here. So it's going to be really useful. I think you can bookmark lessons, you can bookmark posts, you can bookmark individual comments within posts. So I'm using this now to track things that I want to make sure I talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip around a little bit here, but I'm going to start with David Griffiths has a harmonization of Loch Lomond with secondary dominants. And I want to talk about this harmonization here because, well, it's good, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about a few things that are always good to be talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to play stuff on the keyboard here because I'm not going to trust the chord symbol playback. And this is something I want you to get in the habit of thinking about. I've mentioned it before. It always bears repeating. The chord symbol playback in MuseScore is going to be pretty rudimentary. The voice leading isn't going to be terrible, except in a few cases, because it's always going to voice chords within this octave between C and C. unless you change to one of the other voicing styles using properties, and then you'll just get other weirdness. So there's certain things. Oh, it actually puts all the voicings between the C and the B here. So if you ever have like a G7 chord and that's your leading tone, it's never going to resolve it up. It's always not going to resolve it. So you'll have like G7 going to C here. Not ideal, but it's not terrible, and most other voicing will be okay. The real problem is this is just a little high for voicings if you're trying to play the melody at the same time in the same instrument. It's fine if you've got a different instrument going, but often what it means is your chord voicing is going to be above the melody, which is possibly going to obscure things. So for a variety of reasons such as those, I'm always advising you to keep finding alternatives, which is why I spend a lot of time showing you things about voicings. Anyhow, I'm going to play through now the first couple lines here. So first of all, I got to remember if this one in particular is one where, no, okay, this, because I know some people did like a simple version and then a more complex version. So. Oops. I'm assuming there was a G7 and a C to follow. Yeah. Now, that thing I just said, I'm assuming there's a G7 and C to follow. That's a huge statement right there, right? I mean, what we're talking about here is that there's a certain level of predictability to the types of harmonic patterns that we're dealing with here. It's not like there's no new chords that have ever been invented or new ways of using them that anyone's ever come up with, but really, what we are talking about here is finding the well-worn paths through harmony that people have been using. Some of them they've been using for many centuries. Some of them maybe for just the last century or so, or century and a half maybe, like borrowed chords. But if you're on one of these well-worn paths, you should see what's coming. And if I know I'm in the key of C and I've just had a 6 chord followed by a 2 chord, I kind of know what's coming next. It's a 5 and a 1. I might not know the melody, but I certainly, if I didn't know the song already, but I do know the song. So the ability to predict the chord based on the fact that, hey, I see circle of fifths going and I recognize the pattern going on here. One of the things we're after here is learning enough of these patterns, enough of these well-worn paths that A, we can recognize them when we hear them, and B, when we start writing, we kind of know, oh, I think the next thing I should write would be this, and it will therefore sound like, you know, what music normally sounds like. And then you can find all the complicated, interesting ways of getting off the beaten path. But the beaten path is there for a reason. It's familiar to us, right? So we want to find familiar things. So everything that's going on here is quite familiar. 1, 6, 2, 5, right? 1, 6, 2, 5 is going to be one of those super familiar patterns because we are trying to get back to C and working back on the circle of fifths. That's what we get. 5 is what leads to 1, 2 is what leads to 5, and 6 is what leads to 2, right? So, if we start with 1, it's very often going to be this pattern of 1 is going to go to 6, going to go to 2, and then go to 5, and then we'll be back on 1, 2 bars later, and I'll get to Scotland before you. I don't know why that just struck me as funny. So anyhow, that pattern is really nice, and the diatonic version would have been D minor 7 or D minor triad, but secondary dominant, great opportunity for the secondary dominant. You might have thought about a secondary dominant, an A7 chord here, but then you're going to have to contend with the C in the melody. And yeah, depending on the context, you might be okay with that, a dominant 7th chord. I don't know the beginning words, I just know the chorus. You know, maybe you're okay with that clash, maybe you're not. It's going to depend on the context. If your context is jazz, sometimes that's going to be okay, and sometimes it's still going to be weird. So anyhow, really nice. The next phrase, he's going to a 4 chord here. Now, and the first time I saw this, I was like, oh, he missed an opportunity to have a secondary dominant, right? He could have gone C7. He could have used a C7 to tonicize that F. And I was all ready to say, oh, Graham, you missed a good opportunity there. But the chorus of the tune, which is essentially the same melody, he does do that, right? He uses C, C7, going to F. So he totally does that later on. And this is one of the great things about having the kind of palette that I'm trying to show us here. It's a palette that allows you to create a lot of different kinds of sounds. Therefore, so yes, technically the verse is a slightly different melody than the chorus or refrain, but it's not really, right? It's essentially the same melody, just a couple extra syllables there. And so, and if you are going to do additional verses, I don't know how many lyrics have been written to this over the centuries, but probably a lot. And it's nice to have different harmonizations for different verses. And so, yeah, it's a really nice thing to be able to have. So this is a more diatonic version here. And that's fine. And then this, or he has with an inversion, which is, the inversion here is nice because it does give us stepwise motion. And you know, I kind of get on people's case sometimes about using too many inversions. This to me isn't too many inversions, and they're used in appropriate places to me to lead to the important chords. The chords he's leading to are in root position, where I kind of expect, and then the chords that are leading to them are the ones in inversion, and that's a very typical type of usage to create a stepwise line. I like it. And then the line continues by step, so it's really nice. The other thing I was going to mention is that someone else had talked about this last week, I think. This melody absolutely seems like it wants that 6 chord going to the 3 chord. That's backwards as far as the circle of fifths is concerned. But yeah, that's a good motion too. Backwards on the circle of fifths isn't as strong as forwards, but when it fits the melody and it's the right thing to do, it's a beautiful thing to do. And here's a perfect example. 6 going to 3 with that particular melody works great. It's also, here's one of the other things I was going to make sure I mentioned today. It's reminiscent of 4 to 1, which is similarly backwards on the circle of fifths. When I talk about forwards and backwards, down a fifth is forwards. That's normal resolution, like 5 to 1 or 2 to 5. I always do this kind of clockwise motion with my hand. I don't know if the camera is reversing it, making it look counterclockwise, but I always do a clockwise, and also because you're looking at it backwards, but a clockwise motion with my hand to indicate going around the circle of fifths in the normal direction, 2 to 5 to 1, 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. Backwards and then 1 would go on to 4. If you come backwards like 4 back to 1, that's called a plagal cadence when you do it as from 4 to 1, but it's something that we see also. The other thing I want to talk about is this plagal cadence, right? That's the amen at the end of a hymn, right? Amen. So the topic that we're going to be moving into here shortly, well, we've already moved in as a course, but I mean, today I'm going to start talking about borrowed chords in a little bit. One of the first exposures many of us have to borrowed chords is what I call the Easter amen. It's not specifically an Easter thing, but it's something that I associate with a church service where they're doing a hymn and they do the amen at the end of it, and there's all this fancy accompaniment, the organist and maybe a brass section, which is something you often pull out for Easter service. And some fancy amen where it goes from 4 to minor 4 to 1. That is the, am I frozen? Linda, is someone else telling me that I'm frozen? Because that would be not good. It looks like I'm okay. Someone else please confirm, because then I will let me know if I have to fix something. Let me type that in here. Good. Linda, try refreshing or closing window and coming back. That's always the standard things. All right, good to know. Okay, so that fancy amen, 4 to minor 4 to 1. This is like one of the places where I have like a, sort of a primal, like, oh, back to my childhood, I've heard that sound. That is where this term comes from, the minor plagal cadence. Plagal cadence is the term for 4 to 1, P-L-A-G-A-L. Minor plagal cadence is minor 4 to 1 in a major key, and that's what we're going to be looking at in a little bit. So moving on to Graham's chorus, the chorus here, he's got some nice new things going on. So that's beautiful. And then the G back to C. That's a really beautiful progression here, right? And this is what I wanted people to be discovering, opportunities to create really interesting things here. He's still working backwards on the circle of fifths, but remember the previous one that he had the 2 chord right there on the downbeat of bar 2. This one has the 2 chord in the middle of bar 2, so that there can be a 6 chord here. Richard is observing that, yes, if the congregation is singing, you don't necessarily try to do that fancy amen, because people are going to try to sing it themselves and they're going to clash with it. Yeah, so it's definitely more of a performance sort of thing, which is typical with, at least in the Catholic Church, Easter services where they have fancy arrangements and they bring in the brass and they'll come up with all sorts of arrangements with interludes and so forth. And it is more of a performance thing from the choir than a sing-along. So anyhow, in order to do this, he's still using the circle of fifths, working backwards, but at a different rate. So the 2-5-1 comes in quick, and he's able to get the 6 in here, and then he's able to tonicize that 6 with E7. Whoops. So he's able to tonicize the A, and then the D, and then is tonicizing the G. So he's got a couple of secondary dominants he's worked in there. Now, one comment that I made to him in doing this, and I haven't seen, Graham, I think you just posted a response, but I haven't read it yet, is that, ideally, we would have loved to have an A7. We would have loved an A7 here to tonicize the D. But that D and the C are both going to clash with the A7. D is the 4th of the chord. C is the minor 3rd. Neither of them are good choices over major chords or dominant chords. So he tried to kind of hedge it by calling it A sus, which is it's fine to do that, but realistically, I'm not gonna understand that as a dominant 7th chord. I'm really going to understand that as a minor chord, especially given that the C is coming later. So realistically, I'm hearing this as an A minor chord. But it's fine to notate it without the 3rd, as he has. He's also created a nice stepwise motion into it. So this is a really nice stepwise motion into the A. Normally, so if we think about, when I talk about use of inversions and what they actually do, starting a phrase with a chord in an inversion like this is, it's starting that thing in a weak position. And by weak, I don't mean bad. We just talk about strong and weak beats, like, beat 1 being the strong beat in a measure and beat 2 being weak. When you have this second inversion 1 chord, it's what's called a weak inversion, or a weak position for it. And typically, we won't see it at the beginning of a phrase. We'll see it in the final cadence. So like somewhere in here. This is a place where I might expect to see it. Here is like getting that motion into the final one. So this type of line here, starting in second inversion and moving up, is something you don't typically see at the beginning of a phrase. You see it more towards the end of a phrase, but you know, it's still a good it's a good motion no matter how you slice it. And then the next phrase is where he uses that B flat. And this again is a really nice use of inversions to create a stepwise line. I love that line. And it's a great line, and it's one that we're going to come back to. We're going to talk about this line 1 and then 1 7 with the 7th in the bass, leading to 4 with a 3rd in the bass. It creates this descending line. It's a great line. We're going to talk about it more later in the course when I talk about common idioms, which are specific combinations of, like, you know, 4 chords in a row that are used over and over again. My only observation about this is the melody is also the bass note, and then the melody is the bass note again. So we're basically creating parallel octaves. It's not the end of the world, but it is something to consider if you're using, especially if you're using inversions to create a stepwise bass line. You want to make sure your melody is not essentially that same line, or whether you think of it as parallel octaves or just a somewhat lessening of interest there, that's something that could possibly cause you to say, well, I love that bass line, but I'm not going to use it in this spot. Anyhow, and then he's got more stepwise motion. And I love that. Right? That's just another lovely ascending chromatic line using an inversion, but also the D7 is tonicizing the G. It's just really, really nice. So the other reason I wanted to bring that, I'm focusing on this one, is because there were so many nice things happening in it, and then he had some good questions, and I wanted to show you something that I've never really thought about exactly in these terms before. But check out this last phrase. Oops. So it's fine, right? 1 going to 2, going to 5, going to 1. Can't fault that at all. But one of the things that Graham was saying is he wished there were more opportunities to use secondary dominants, but there were places where the melody got in the way of that. And this is potentially one of those places, because when I see that D minor here, I might want to tonicize it, right, with an A7 and have, I might want to have an A7 here, but that C is going to, again, give me pause. Every time that C is in the melody, it's going to make me not want to use A7. And so you look at this and say, oh, well, I guess I can't use a secondary dominant here. This trick I'm about to show you, it goes beyond just secondary dominant. It's just a super cool trick. And that is, okay, we've got a 2 chord here, and I see why we have a 2 chord, because it's going to 5, and that circle fits, and that's all well and good. But one of the very first things we learned in this course was about substitution, functional substitution, 2 and 4 substituting for each other. What if instead of D minor here, what if instead I had an F? If I had an F chord here, then the secondary dominant for that would be C7. And I could totally do that now. I no longer have that issue of a note clashing with the chord. So sometimes by substituting out your target chord, you can create situations where a secondary dominant wasn't going to work, but now it does. And realistically, that's going to be the time when it happens over and over again. You've got a 2 there now, and the melody is clashing with your secondary dominant. But if you change that 2 to a 4, then maybe your melody won't clash with it, or vice versa. Occasionally it works the other way around, not as often. But so 2 and 4, the fact that they can substitute for each other, put that in your pocket, put that in your back pocket. We're going to come back and use that some more in the future. So anyhow, there was a lot to unpack about this one piece, so many things done so well, and I just wanted to show what they were and then talk about some of my observations about them. So anyhow, great job on that one, Graham. The other thing that I want to flip over now to is another really good example here, and this is Kevin Johnson's Billy Boy. So Billy Boy is like Yeah, it's a traditional song. I don't know its history. I do know that it has a famous jazz cover from what's on a Miles album, but it's a Miles Davis, but it's Red Garland's arrangement, right? And now I'm forgetting. So I'm going to play through. So he's got his first version. That's all primary triads. Right, y'all know this song. Right, so that's Billy Boy with 1, 4, and 5. I think probably I've not heard a 4 chord here. I think in this spot, I think I've just heard 2 measures of 5 in simplistic versions, or perhaps 2, 5. So I'm not as accustomed to hearing the 4 chord here. I think, but it's going to turn out to be awesome that he did that, because here's now his version where for this assignment, so now I'm jumping into the world of borrowed chords now, and so we're still going to talk about secondary dominants, but we're also going to be talking about borrowed chords. And the idea that we're going for in this project is finding every cadence, every approach to 1, and seeing if we can replace it with a minor 4 or a flat 7. Those are the chords that I talked about at the very beginning here. So every time we have something leading to 1, whether it's 5 to 1, or like this measure here is 5 to 1, or if we have a place where it's 4 to 1, we're going to replace the 5 or the 4, whatever is there approaching 1, with minor 4 to 1, and see how we like it. The reality is some of the places are going to work better than others, but you won't know which until you try them all. So this is what we're doing here. We're taking every single cadence, every single place where we're approaching 1, and looking, can we put a minor 4 chord in there? And then if we can, also look at if we can put its friend, the flat 7 chord, in there too, because that also sounds pretty cool when it works. It's definitely more of a jazzy sound, not exclusively. It's also big in Broadway show tunes, all the Cole Porter, he used that sound a lot. The classic, Rodgers and Hammerstein and all the classic Broadway composers use that sound as well. But it's not one you find as often in classical music. But minor 4, yes. Flat 7, more jazz and pop. All right. So he's done exactly that. He's used this minor 4 chord and flat 7 chord. So if we look here in the very beginning, this is his reharmonized version, starting here measure 17. He has actually put in a minor 4 chord right here in the second bar, saying, well, here's an approach to 1. There wasn't anything there before. It was just more C. And he didn't put a G chord there because that C in the melody kind of conflicted with that. Would have clashed a little bit. If he played it as a sus chord, he could have gotten away with it. But he didn't worry about it here because this is the simplistic primary version. It doesn't matter what you put here. You can put a 5 chord sus, or you can put a 4 chord and come back to 1. He knew he was going to think about replacing it anyhow. So here's his minor 4 chord. And then instead of coming back to 1, he comes back to 3, which is one of those functional substitutions, 3 substituting for 1. And that's fine. And then he's using a flat 7 chord as the approach into the next measure. And there was some discussion about how good that sounded or didn't sound. But let me play those first 4 bars now. Now, instantly, it sounds a whole lot like jazz, right? As opposed to, right? 4 bars of C is dull. And, but this, suddenly, totally works. There's other harmonizations possible, but by trying out those, he's now got some ideas about, oh, here are some things that I can do. One thing that I will say is that jumping directly from a tonic chord to the minor 4 chord, it's not that we never do that, but more often we prepare it by putting in a regular 4 chord or a 2 chord. So think about this. Major 4, minor 4, 3. That idea of putting the major 4 first. Let me do that better. I'm forgetting the minor, sorry. I'm trying to voice it. I don't want to have a 7th on my minor 4 chord if the major 7th is in the melody, and that's what I messed up there. And then here we could go 2, then flat 7, 1. So, you know, if we do some surgery here to help prepare our way into these minor 4s or flat 7s, it might cause you to like them better. And that's worth exploring as well. And now he's got, so here he's got the exact situation that I was talking about where he's approaching this A minor and wanted to put a secondary dominant here, E7, and the melody note is the wrong 3rd, right? The melody note is the G over that E7. And yeah, Graham, voicing matters a lot. Voicing totally matters. Like this G is nicely supported also by a 9th. And this ends up being a nice spread of notes that sounds good. And we don't have notes on top of the G. So those are all things that'll get in the way. So now we have it. So we have this E7 chord with G in the melody. And there again, you have to decide how okay you are with that dissonance. You know, the thing is, dominant 7th chords, by their very nature, have dissonance, right? They have a tritone. And that's the nature of dominant 7th chords, is they're supposed to have dissonance. They're supposed to create tension that leads you to that aim, that leads you down a 5th. So that tritone coming down, you know, da-dum and ba-dum. So that tritone resolving inward like that, that's an important part of what dominant 7s are about. So the mere fact that there's dissonance in here, well, that doesn't faze me because the dominants are all about tension and having some, but it is stylistically out of keeping with most of the classical tradition. It's less out of keeping in a blues or a jazz or a rock tradition. Some people might know this as the purple haze chord. That's where rock musicians generally know that from. I know it from Chameleon, a Herbie Hancock tune. So yeah, that sound of having a minor 3rd and a major 3rd at the same time, it really comes to us from the blues. So either you're okay with a blues sound or you're not, but I want to point out you can use it. And then he has the C sharp tonicizing the D. This D7 is a secondary dominant going to the G, so that's all great. C sharp is, you know, instead of A7, he's got a C sharp. And frankly, I think A7 might have worked a little better there to my ears because this F a little bit clashes with the C sharp diminished. The way to get rid of that clash is to leave the E out of the voicing. And then it works better. But if I put an A in the bass, I guess I'm less likely to include the E. There's a thing where, you know, if we're playing complex chords, dominant 7th chords, and adding flat 9ths and flat 13ths, we usually leave out the 5th because then it just starts to get cluttered. So if I had written A7 here, or if Kevin had written A7 instead of C sharp diminished, I would have instinctively left out the E and therefore not had to deal with that dissonance. So this is a little bit dissonant, but if I leave out the E, then it's fine. So sometimes your chord choice can be improved by good voicing choice, as Graham was observing earlier with that B flat 7. But sometimes just respelling the chord a little bit, because really A7 to D or C sharp diminished to D is really the same basic motion. It's a secondary dominant. 5 of 2 or 7 of 2. 5 and 7 are kind of interchangeable. All right, so the next thing is my favorite part in here. And this is the part where I mentioned I'm glad he used a 4 chord somewhere I wasn't expecting. Check this out. I don't want to hear that song any other way now. That nails it. That is how the song should have gone from day one. 4, minor 4 to flat 7 to 1. 4, minor 4, flat 7, 1. That's perfect. That is textbook minor plagal cadence there. 4, then minor 4 and flat 7, kind of sharing a measure here. It sounds like a million other jazz standards and things. It doesn't sound like it's coming from a folk song world, and it just absolutely fits fits the vibe perfectly. It would also have fit perfectly if that had been a 2 chord, by the way. That is also perfectly fine to start with a 2 chord to go to your minor 4. And that's what Rachmaninoff did, right? In that example that I posted before, it was in the key of E. So 2 chord to the minor 4 chord to 1. So that motion from 2 to minor 4 to 1 or 4 to minor 4 to 1 are both very powerful. So anyhow, this to me makes the whole arrangement, because everything in it is fine, but this is the keeper. And by the keeper, I mean, like I said, I don't want to hear it any other way. I think every single arrangement of this song should use those 2 bars there, or a version with D minor instead, because it's like perfect. Then 3, 6, 3, and again he's relying on the fact that in a jazz or blues or rock tradition, we can be okay with a dominant 7th chord, even though it's got a minor 3rd in it. If it was more of a classical thing, I guess that would have to be A minor, which would be fine too. 4, minor 4. In this case, he went from minor 4 to 5, and the reason he's doing that is the leading tone in the melody. That leading tone in the melody is not going to be consistent with an F minor chord. If I play things on this Cincy keyboard and take it out of context, anything can either sound good or sound bad, depending on your point of view. But I will say, in general, when we have that minor 4 chord, we don't want to use the leading tone in the melody. So if the leading tone is prominent in the melody like it is here, we don't want that minor 4, and therefore he can't get away with a minor 4 for the whole bar. And having a minor 4 for a couple beats and then a 5, that's not a bad idea. Minor 4 to 5 to 1. And Graham, I believe you mentioned that if that had been a 2, 4, then minor 4, then 2. So F minor instead in bar 29. So F minor. So you're talking about doing, let's see, this. So starting in bar 29, Graham was talking about minor 4, then 2, 5 to 1. That totally works as well. You call it classic, and I'm not sure if it's maybe a thing used in barbershop or some specific tradition that I'm not as familiar with, but usually after the minor 4, we're ready for the 1. We don't put in a whole 2, 5, but it's not like I've never heard it before, but I am curious what frame of reference you might have for that sound, because to me it's like a slightly unusual sound, but a nice one. There's no reason minor 4 has to come right to 1. It could go from minor 4 and then have a 2, 5 to 1. That's perfectly acceptable as well. All right, so these 2 pieces that we've looked at today, I thought were just really, really well done. A lot of great things happening, and a few things to talk about as far as little areas of could this be tweaked in this way and so forth. So I wanted to spend a lot of time on these. I do want to briefly look at a few others that came up because they were also interesting things going on. So I'm going to come back and look at one. This is Barbara Miller's version of Red River Valley, and this is using secondary dominants. So let's take a look at this. in, even though she did't write it, because it should be there. All right, so this is really good too. And there's some really great things going on. Again, there's some use of inversions, but I feel like they're well done uses of inversions. This stepping into that E minor works really great. Now, if the goal is to push secondary dominance, I'm going to observe that that B minor could have been a secondary dominant, right? That could have been a B7. So totally would have worked, right? Also, this D minor 7, this is an interesting chord here because it's not in the key, right? It's not in the key of G. It is part of a tonicization of the C chord, but normally this is like the 2 chord in the key of C. Well, we don't often go directly from 2 to 1. But in this particular situation, having that stepwise motion does make that direct motion from 2 to 1 seem like it makes sense. I would suggest that we could have them both. We could have a quick 2-5, either D minor 7 to G7 to C. And don't think the bass can't move that fast, because it can. If someone's trying to sing it, maybe not, but certainly any other instrument can do it. And that could be a situation where you do put a G7 over D here. So I have my E minor 7, then G7 with a D in the bass to C. So you can have your cake and eat it too, as it were, by having a G7 over D here. You can still have your stepwise motion, but then you can have circle of fifths motion, 5 of 4 to 4 instead of 2 of 4 to 4, right? In the key of C, 5 to 1 is stronger than 2 to 1. But the point is, we're still using that concept of tonicization, and it's working either way. And then she's trying to solve the same issue that we have to solve over and over again, which is, we know we want a dominant 7th chord, but there's a note that clashes with it in that there's the 4th in the melody, right? The G in the melody kind of clashes with the D chord. So by spelling it as D sus, you kind of get around that, and that's fine. So she's able to have a D sus here so that the G being held over doesn't clash with the F sharp. And then she resolves it to D and just says, you know what, that D chord, even though it's got an F sharp in it, I don't mind hearing the G after, the chord comes in, then the G, and then come back here. And I absolutely agree with that. Sometimes we go a little overboard in avoiding situations where that 4th is in the melody. And if it's not a super prominent note, you can get away with it. And I absolutely think she made the right choice. So then she's got essentially the same progression here. And again, I'll make the same observation. Secondary dominant could have worked. Either way, this G is clashing a little with the F sharp there. So I might have not used that inversion. I might have just gone with root position. Or the minor version. So I might have just tried to avoid that clash. This is considered like one of the worst clashes there is, the minor 9th clash, an octave and a half step. And there's situations where it can be okay, in particular when it's between the root and the flat 9 of a dominant 7th chord. We're usually okay with that one, but we usually try to avoid that particular dissonance, and in particular if it involves either the melody or the bass, and in this case, both. So Joanne, for these projects, we're not changing the melody. We are trying to avoid changing the melody. I will say that you do see that happen. You do see when people are making arrangements of pieces and they want to try some harmonic things and they're like, man, I want this chord to work, but it clashes with the melody. You will see people change the melody for that. Obviously, that's not going to work if you're doing a sing-along sort of setting, because this is a case where you need to make sure the person playing or singing the melody knows the change. But yes, I do occasionally see that. To me, it's like cheating, but we've all cheated on that. So, so anyhow, I love this motion, right? This tonicization of the A minor chord works perfectly. It works absolutely perfectly. And again, it's a nice use of an inversion, the G sharp resolving to the A minor. Ooh, really nice. Now, this line is what I started to say. She's going A, then A minor with a G. I absolutely needed that A minor. That A minor with a G in the bass, its main purpose of existing is to lead to an F sharp. Anytime you've got that line of a chord, then that same chord with a seventh in the bass, and that's going to go down a step. That's just what it's going to do. The whole reason to have this chord is so that we can go down to this bass note. So I would want this D to have an F sharp in the bass, but other than that, perfect. And here she's just using a plain diatonic five chord. And then she's again using that in the key of C, 2 chord, going to 4. And here is another situation. She's going to a 4 chord, which is absolutely where you want to go. Check this out and tell me if you think we can get away with it. If I'm, oh, well, I know we can. We could have used, yeah, we totally could have used a 5 chord here, right? G7 to C. But then she's got E minor and A minor, circle of fifths, diatonic, all good. Now, what's happening here at E flat? If you are looking for opportunities, this assignment was for secondary dominance, but if you wanted to look ahead and think about using minor 4 chords, anytime you see that note in the melody, scale degree flat 6, that's the note that makes the minor 4 chord what it is, right? It is the note that makes the minor 4 chord worth borrowing. Scale degree flat 6. If you're just like looking through some sheet music, trying to find examples of borrowed chords, which I absolutely recommend you do. Look through all the music you're familiar with. Try to ask yourself, where do I heard that sound before? Find some of those spots and see if you see scale degree flat 6. And then you can build the chord. Then you can look at the rest of the chord. But if you don't see scale degree flat 6, you don't have a minor 4 chord. All right. So anyhow, I see that in the melody. I want a minor 4 chord there, even though this particular project she was doing wasn't that. I just want to point out. Now here's my minor 4 chord. I'm going to go major 4, minor 4 to 1. Isn't that nice? It's really a nice little line there. So it's an opportunity to get the major 4 and the minor 4 and then the 1. And her 1 chord is in second inversion. This is the thing. Graham, was it Graham? Yes, I'm pretty sure it was Graham when I was talking earlier about where to use that for 1 chord in second inversion. And I say that it sort of has this certain, it's in a weak position. And I take the word weak here. I'll say it has tension associated with it. That tension is associated with the final push to the final cadence. This is where I expect it, and this works perfectly here. This is why I said the last phrase is one where we often see a 1 chord in second inversion. And then she does the let it be thing there. So instead of letting that 4 chord, and instead of having that 5 chord go directly to 1, she goes to 4 first and then 1. It's a deceptive cadence, if you will. It's something that you don't see that 5 going to 4 like this outside the world of pop music a whole lot. You see it in blues, 5 to 4 to 1. But this particular thing is all over pop music, and in particular, it's Let It Be. Right? Let it be, let it be, let it be. Right? That little figure is all over the place. That 4, and then walking down to 1. And often in thirds like that. That is the pop cliche there, and nailed it here. So this chord here, this B minor chord going to the A minor, I think I would have preferred to see an E here to get some circle of fifths. And if you do that, the F sharp is a non-chord tone, and then it resolves to a chord tone, which is fine. The way she has it with the B minor, the F sharp is the chord tone, the G is the non-chord tone, and it works either way, but circle of fifths always wins to me. Now, could I make a stepwise, I'm trying to see if I can make that chromatic bass line happen here, with a D, B with a D sharp in the bass, going to E minor. But if I land on an E minor here, I'm not in position to do this little cadence here. So I probably wouldn't really do that, but I wanted to try it. One, and then B with a D sharp in the bass. I could do a quick, but I didn't like the sound of that. So no, I think I would just have used an E here instead of an E minor, not an E7 because of the G natural, but an E minor going to the A, and that would have made me happy. Now, also, if we're going to start playing with minor 4 chords, totally could use a minor 4 chord there. 4, minor 4, 1. Now, I probably wouldn't have then, if I was going to use the minor 4 chord, I then wouldn't have done the little trick of resolving, of using this, the let it be thing there. I wouldn't have done that coming out of a minor 4 chord, going to a major 4 chord. Probably not. All right, so lots of good stuff in there too. So the last thing I want to try to address here a little bit, Lonnie, if you're around, I do want to take a look at your piece and just see what I can say about it. Because there's a lot going on here. You've got some really nice voicings, but it's a little hard for me to sort out everything that's happening. And so I do want to just sort of check this out. I'll let MuseScore play it first because I know it'll play it accurately. And then I would just want to talk about it for a few minutes. All right, so yeah, I think you've really done a marvelous job on so many counts of finding first of all, finding dominance, secondary dominance, somewhat more, you say, but there's a ton of secondary dominance in here. You've got some really nice motions of those. And as far as like the chord voicings and so forth, a lot of those are also really good. Some of them I might say, well, we're a little thick or a little bottom heavy on them, but part of that's how MuseScore plays them, and I need to kind of work some things out for myself. But yeah, I just want to look at a few things going on here and see if we can sort out some of what's happening and some of the places where I'm like, oh, this works great, and this is a place where I have like a little bit of a question. So one is right at the beginning is perfect, right? We have, whoops, 1. I'm not going to play your exact voicings. And then 4, and then you have 5 of 5, right? So this is an F chord in the key of E flat. That's a dominant 2 chord. And normally that would resolve to 5. And in your case, it's going to 1, 6, 4. It's going to 1 chord in second inversion. And I want everyone to be aware of that. That 1 chord in second inversion is like a stand-in for 5. It still has scale degree 5 in the bass. Scale degree 5 in the bass. So whether we play an actual 5 chord, because that would be the expected thing. Right? 5 of 5 to 5, that would be the expected thing for 5 of 5 to do. But if it instead goes to 1, 6, 4, it might as well be 5. 1, 6, 4 is like I said, kind of a stand-in for 5. Normally, it would then go to an actual 5. But she's done like substitution on top of substitution here. So instead of letting that 1, 6, 4 go to 5, which would have been the expected thing. So let's establish that first, right? If we had that 4 and then dominant 2, 5 of 5, going to 1, 6, 4 to 5 to 1. That would be the expected resolutions. But she's taken her 1, 6, 4, said, you know what, I'm not going to give you a 5. Instead, I'm going to use this G7 chord, basically. She's actually voiced it as a diminished chord, and it's got a non-chord tone in the melody, which, you know, is like a dissonance, but not a bad dissonance. But if this was going to be a deceptive resolution, think about that. If this was going to go 1, 6, 4, 5, 1, it could also have gone 1, 6, 4, 5, 6, right? So we're used to that. And 5, if 5 is going to go to 6, I've observed before that we can put in that secondary dominant. And so that's where she's looking like she's sending us. She looks like she's going to send us to a C minor chord. But then she actually deceptively resolves that G7. This, I'm going to call it G7, even though there's not an actual G in it. So instead of resolving the G to C minor, she's resolving it to A flat. That's the deceptive resolution. Instead of 5 to 1 in C minor, that's 5 to flat 6. So that works beautifully. It is a little odd having that note in the melody against it, but it works great. And then she's got another secondary dominant here, which I would expect to go to 3, right? This is 5 of 3, as she says. It's D7. I expect this to go. I expect it to go to G minor. Now, she doesn't go to G minor right away. She throws in, she puts another chord in between the secondary dominant and its resolution. Now, you can do that sometimes. I wouldn't get in the habit of doing it too much, especially if you've got a whole lot of secondary dominants going on already that's starting to possibly obscure the tonal center of the piece. But there's no law that says this has to go directly here, and especially if the melody is something other than a chord tone over that G minor. But I probably would have gone directly, let the bass go directly to the G. G, G, and let the C be a non-chord tone over it. There's a number of other chords, like what could have been, like you have the C minor chord here, or a diminished chord. We're going to learn more about that particular diminished chord resolution in the next section. But then you've got this very nice 5 of 2 going to 2, 5, 1. So yeah, it's really nice stuff going on here. And then the next phrase also, so this phrase is also really nice. You have this chord that you've labeled as 4, 6, 4, add 9. I don't hear it that way. Yeah, I guess it's a 4 chord. It's an A flat chord with the E flat in the bass so that it sounds a little more tonic-y. Just like I said, 1, 6, 4 kind of stands in for the dominant. 1, 6, 4 can stand in for the tonic a little bit. I probably would have resolved it. I probably would have done. So this chord that you're calling flat minor 6 plus, let's sort out what's really going on here. You have a note you're calling C flat, a G, and a B, and a D, and an A flat. That resolves down to G. This is a G triad. Okay, it's a 7th with the F. This is just a G7 chord going to C minor. So this is a secondary dominant. This is 5 of 6 going to 6. this is my main point of looking at this piece. There's a lot of things like that in this piece where the sound itself, you've nailed the right sound, but the labeling of it is confusing things a bit. So this is just G7. This is just 5. So that C flat should be spelled D. There's no reason to spell it C flat. It's just 5 of 6 going to 6. It's a perfectly traditional secondary dominant. And then you've got 6, 5, 4. And that progression, 6, 5, 4, yes, it's stepping down. I said 5 doesn't often go to 4. Certainly not at the end of a piece in classical music, but that particular type of phrase from 5 walking down, treating the 5 as kind of a passing chord to get to 4, that's one of the situations where you do see 5 go directly to 4 in classical harmony. And then here you do have that 5 of 3, that D7 go directly to G minor. And then again, you have the secondary dominant 5 of 2, otherwise known as 6. And in this case, instead of going to 2, you skip the 2 and go to 5. And that's okay also. Sometimes a secondary dominant can skip the chord it's going to and go one step ahead, but it's definitely pushing the envelope a little bit. And so there's a lot of little details like that in here where if you really want to nail the fundamental sound, I would say just let it go to 2, all right? When I say anything 5 can do, 2, 5 can do better, the other thing I sometimes say is or vice versa. So you could have told me, oh, I had a 2, 5 there, and then I let the 5 substitute for it. And I would have said, okay, I hear where you're coming from. But these are the sort of details where sometimes you're like 2 or 3 steps ahead of where we want to be in doing this. And I'd really love to see the sort of basic thing here of the 5 of 2 going directly to the 2 chord. And again, things like the labeling of this chord. So there's a few other places like that where there's something that's like a really nice sound, but I think it's a little mislabeled or the resolution has been oddly delayed or something, and in which just a few little details or changes to the voice leading, I think would make a huge difference in our perceptions of this piece. So I think this is off to a fantastic start, and I think there's just a few tweaks that could make us love this piece that much more. So I'm going to leave it at that and come back to my theme music here and turn the volume down on it. There we go. So thanks everyone for all the music that's been coming in and all the discussion. This has been really fun for me to get to share all these ideas with people and see your responses to them. So we're just going to stay on this subject of borrowed chords, and we're always going to stick with secondary dominants throughout the course because that's the most important topic. So next week we'll be back more of this. Elliot, I see you have a MuseScore question, and I guess I can just say go to the MuseScore support forum. That's the best place to get your MuseScore questions answered. I don't have experience with Mac in particular, so I can't help with that. But Elliot, if you go to the MuseScore support forum on musescore.org, you will probably get some. It says no response yet. Go ahead and post in my support space on our community here. Post a link to where it is in musescore.org, and I'll see if I can poke someone in the arm and get them to reply. All right, so thanks everyone, and I will see you coming back to you from Colorado again next week. Bye.